How do racialized imaginaries queer gender practices? How do gender-based exclusions help racial prejudices perform discriminative acts? How do we incorporate race and trans studies into inclusive pedagogies for Shakespeare courses? Hello and welcome to another episode of the Shakespeare Race and Pedagogy podcast. I'm Dr. Wendy Lennon, and today I'm joined by a very special guest, Professor Alexa Alice Joubin, who will explore these questions with me. Alexa is the inaugural recipient of the Bell Hooks Legacy Award. She writes about critical AI studies, race, gender, and Shakespeare. She is a professor at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., where she directs the Digital Humanities Institute. Welcome, Alexa. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Wendy. It's my honor to be here.
So let's start with the first question then. How do racialized imaginaries queer gender practices?
So I've noticed that racist ideas often rely on notions of purity. And so racialization makes gender practices seem exotic and strange sometimes. So racism and misogyny, they really borrow from each other's playbooks. And I'm going to make some observations about what the problems are. And I have a proposal, strengths as method, as a partial solution. So in historical context, and also in our contemporary context, there are actually many examples of racial differences being imagined as inverted gender norms. That's why I say kind of race can queer gender practices. And some of these are actually self-contradictory if you think about them. So, for example, there was this idea that Jewish men were said to menstruate. These are all early modern examples, and I'm drawing Ania Lumba's pioneering work. Muslim men were believed to be sodomites. Egyptian women were said to urinate standing up, and so forth. And of course, Amazons were believed to be witches and cannibals. So basically, these are non-normative beings, and race and gender always intersect there. One borrows from the other. How about my own example here? I think that should be of some interest in terms of how race and gender are connected, and how imaginations about gender also affect racialization. I only became Asian when I immigrated to the United States. I grew up in Taiwan, and I belonged to a dominant ethnic group there. I spoke the dominant local language, and so I did not have or need a marked or remarkable identity. Basically, we didn't use like Asianness as a category. We didn't need that label, right? And so questions of racial and gender otherness loomed large in my academic life as an immigrant, but also as a woman of color. I did not pass through and could not pass by after immigrating to the US. My fashion choices were very much off by American standards. I didn't even pick up on insults hurled at me, taking underhandedly derogatory comments or compliment, for example. And so this is a process that kind of becoming noticeable, becoming racialized, and become gendered. I was reading Julia Kristeva, who writes about her experience going to China in the mid-century. And I felt very much like a monkey under the white gaze. She felt like a monkey under the Chinese gaze. So this is a real life example of how these two categories that work together. I would say, just in conclusion of these experiences and the historical observations, we know that race-making practices, they can amplify prescriptive social scripts of gender, and gender expressions then become racialized. So the word race-making basically refers to the production and dissemination of racial ideas. And this can be in life or in the arts. And race-making can enforce representational practices of gender as well. I'm someone who studies film and performance, so I'm very interested in representational practices like techniques to perform something. And sometimes I call these technologies of representation, like stagecraft, filmcraft. And so one place we can observe this intersection at work is that on stage or in film, sometimes ideal femininity is imagined as whiteness. It's basically the two are very much closely connected. They are considered the same thing. In other areas, how about Asianness? So there are stereotypes of Asian men being somehow more effeminate. And so with the late Martin Orton, I co-authored this book called Race. It's published by Routledge. And in there, I was investigating exactly this problem. If Asian men are somehow more effeminate, there are also the tropes of East Asian women as easier to take advantage of than their white counterparts. They are simultaneously China dolls and dragon ladies. So China dolls refer to kind of imaginary submissive young women who need to be rescued. And then dragon ladies are out there to deceive men. They are kind of femme fatales. And there's this unique concept called yellow fever. Yellow fever paints East Asian women as subservient, dainty, and feminine. In contemporary American discourse on dating, yellow fever has been used to critique the social phenomenon of white men who exclusively seek out East Asian women as partners. So it's a kind of Orientalist tendency. And there are many examples. There is a 2012 documentary film called Seeking Asian Female. And director Debbie Long, she interviewed many white men, primarily in San Francisco, and they eroticize and exoticize East Asian women's physiques and manners. So I would say Kimberly Crenshaw remains very relevant, even if her notion of intersectionality emerged quite some time ago now. Among some of the best quotes is that she said, the problem with identity politics is not that it fails to transcend difference, but rather the opposite, that, identity politics conflate intra-group differences, and that therein lies the rub, right? I think about a racially homogeneous group. Are they actually exactly the same? There are a lot of intra-group differences that we need to talk about. Well, women as a group. And of course, it is more challenging to attend to multiple kind of variants at the same time, but I think it's very necessary. So that's how race can make gender practices seem exotic and vice versa.
That's so interesting. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and your experiences. I think that's going to be really, really useful to think about in the classroom for people to think about their own identities. I also draw upon Kimberly Crenshaw's methodologies, and that idea of intersectionality is really, really important to the work that I do. So that second question then, how do gender-based exclusions help racial prejudices perform discriminative acts? I think you were drawing upon some of those points there, but could you just elaborate further?
Racial prejudices give fuel to sexism and misogyny. And gender-based exclusions have also made it easier for racism to carry out its work, like perform discriminant acts. For example, think of a character or an individual. I spoke of my journey to America and how I became Asian, how I became yellow here. I react differently, I relate differently to my world once I'm labeled as such, right? Or as women of color, for example, versus in my native country where it was more racially homogeneous and such notions didn't exist. So we didn't think of ourselves as Asian. Well, everybody's Asian. Kimberly Crenshaw notes that although racism and sexism readily intersect in the lives of real people. They seldomly do in feminist and anti-racist practices. That was her context back then. I'm really pleased to see the field evolving so quickly. As anti-racist feminist work right now, they do bring kind of critical race theories and gender theories together far more often. So that is a huge step. I wanted to actually bring in something from trans studies, which I think is really important, and is specifically this term, the cis-tem. It is a new word coined by Black feminist scholar Marquise Bay. And it's a combination of the notion of cisgender and the word the system. So it became system. So what does this entail, and what does this have to do with how racial prejudices are fueled by gender biases? Basically, if you think of the word, it's cisgender and system. It's not really just about cisgender sexism. I've been studying transness in so-called cisgender and monoracial narratives, and I find transness a pervasive property. So the system is a social and administrative structure that is just given to us matter-of-factly. And it structures how we are believed to be able to exist, according to Marquise Bay. The system is built on the idea of racial purity and gender binary. So again, I go back to what I started. I've observed that there's this fetishization of various forms of purity that is really fueling notions of race and gender. The system brings up questions of membership, of exclusionary membership, such as who is a real American, who is a real woman, who is more oppressed and therefore more justified to be angry. To bring up this article in the Oxford Handbook of Shakespeare and Race that I recently published. It's called Trans Studies at the Crossroad. And one of the problems that I mentioned is that race making and gender practices are assumed to predicate upon substitutions. So this is the notion of kind of, you see a character on stage, and in your head, you're substituting the actor, right, underneath, with a character being depicted. And so this can work in terms of race, in terms of gender, in terms of the so-called cross-dressing in Shakespeare. And I find this substitution idea very problematic because, right, the power of Marquise Bay's system, CISTEM, the system, it is maintained and hidden by the disconnected stories we tell, stories that seem to be not related, stories that seem to be confront racism, but they actually don't address the systemic forces that produce inequality. And so once we understand the system, CISTEM, we'll be able to think more holistically about purity and this obsession. So it's a totalizing system. It disguises its own operation. It does this really well. So when there's failure in the system, we think of it as personal failures, and they're not related to one another, right? And this can be applied to dramatic analysis. Othello's problem becomes personalized. It is his peculiar failure after all, right? And students may not be thinking of larger issues, why there is this problem to begin with. And so this system has a core function of erasure. It even erases itself, according to Marquise Bay. And then it makes individuals' experiences illegible. We'll say, oh, it's not relatable. I can't really understand it. So systemic purity, it goes beyond cisgender preferences to govern academic pedigrees, accents, writing styles, identities, disciplinary norms, or political morals, or how we would interpret Shakespeare. I'm going to bring in another scholar, feminist scholar Sarah Ahmed. Her research shows that there's this pervasive but overlooked sense of purity, and it's producing institutionalized whiteness and sexism. And these biases, these problems are only visible to those who do not inhabit it. Like basically, if you're marginalized, if you're victimized, maybe you see a little bit better. So there's that invisibility in it. So the notion of purity gives rise to acceptable type of diversity, and then less desirable type of diversity in academia. So discourses about racial purity, they really influence sexist ideals of binary femininity and masculinity. So Marquis Bay put it well, gender is always racial arrangement. I would say the other direction is also true. So basically, we need to dismantle this. So dismantle this system. I think trans as method could do part of that work. So trans as method involves the use of trans perspectives to examine racism and misogyny at the same time in the system. The racialized notion of purity and cisgender sexism, they're basically two sides of the same coin. So we need to tackle this obsession with any form of purity, pure blood. Trans as method has an aesthetic dimension. By saying that, I meant that we are looking at the artifice, like artifice of racism. And so if we borrow disability studies insight, scholar Tobin Sieber once says that aesthetics, basically, it's very simple. It's about how some bodies make other bodies feel. Imagine we're in the same room and there are atypical experiences. People come with different body types, different types of bodies, marked by race and gender, and those bodies would make us feel in particular ways, right? So that's trans aesthetics. I use transness to refer actually to a broad range of identity practices beyond gender assignment, beyond gender reassignment. That's like not strictly what I'm talking about. Transness is a mode of analysis here, rather than a project to diagnose trans people, to locate trans people in Shakespeare, per se. And so trans can be a verb, can be a bit of a preface. It's actually useful in anti-racist feminist resistance to the patriarchal symbolic order, because transness refuses to be consigned to a destination. Like there is a predetermined destination where you have to go, or some kind of final form you have to evolve into, right? And so it is useful here in recognizing the transient nature of life, in recognizing the fluidity and possibility of life. Who knows what tomorrow would bring? You know, a lot of these kind of restrictions is that we imagine ourselves and characters we encounter to always have a final destination. This is who they are. That's it. And that in itself is actually a symptom of the system, CISTEM. And it is racist in nature. So how about some examples? So one is this, I know probably not many people know the film. So it's called Stage Beauty, directed by Richard Eyre, who's actually done quite a few Shakespeare films. It came out in 2004. As you see on the screen here, in the movie, a Restoration era adult boy actor, his name is Ned Keniston. So he plays first Desdemona, and then later in his career, he plays Othello. He plays this trans feminine white Desdemona, and then later he plays Othello according to the convention of his time. So this is an example how we can bring critical race and trans studies together and make them intersect. So this is him as Desdemona, quote, dying beautifully, as he says all the time. He's very proud of it. So interestingly, he plays exclusively female roles on stage, but he also presents as feminine off stage. King Charles II eventually bans men from performing female roles, and then Keniston is out of the job. He's not even sure of his purpose, and he's rejected by his male lover. So at an all-time low. He starts taking up the role of Othello. And in the movie, this is part of his journey through some kind of binary heterosexual masculinity. And so this movie is about historical theater practices and also much more about that, right? Because it's really about how Kingston trances, if you use trans as a verb, trans as race, trans as gender. So first of all, he makes this connection between femininity and Desdemona's whiteness. And then he connects masculinity and what he imagines to be Moorish mannerisms. So eventually he is proverbially baptized as a cisgender man when he takes on the act of killing Desdemona on stage. In playing Desdemona, he's really kind of associating dying beautifully with fragile white femininity and then projecting ideal womanhood on his trans embodiment of the role. But importantly, none of this would be possible. His Othello would not be possible were it not for the oppositional idea of pure white innocent Desdemona.
What's the name of the film, Alexa?
Stage Beauty.
Ah, I see. Okay.
The film is called Stage Beauty. I think it's in reference to the notion, the artifice of constructed beauty, who is Desdemona. Actually, Desdemona becomes the main character in this imagination of Othello. So on the side here, you see Maria Hughes, played by Claire Denis, who is Keniston, the superstar, is his dresser. And later on, they fall in love, and Maria begins performing Desdemona against Keniston's blackface Othello. So, if we look at this through a trans studies perspective, Keniston's blackface Othello is actually transitive. It is part of his transition from what some characters see as deviant, and then he goes into a more conformist role. So the stage itself, that space, is transitive for Keniston because he constructs new identities for his character and for himself right there. So he appropriates violent black masculinity, and he can only do that based on the projected vulnerability of white femininity. Otherwise, this would not be possible. So it's really see how they intertwine. And even better, the fragile white femininity was presented by him earlier, defined by him, right, through the role of Desdemona. So in the end, his appropriation of racial and gender roles, they actually ended up expanding the social structure of the time, the available structure for discussing race and gender. In doing this, is kind of pushing the envelope a little bit. He's kind of using his imaginations of ideal femininity through Desdemona's fragile whiteness to construct later on his imagination of toxic masculinity through his blackface. In other words, the gender roles that he's performing, he's imagining, cannot be disassociated from his racialized ideas. So race becomes a prosthesis and a heuristic device in his gender practices. So race is an aid. Race is a prosthetic tool through which he would then understand what gender is. So that's what's going on here. And I hope this kind of clarifies the second question here. How do gender-based exclusions help to fuel racial prejudice?
So that third question, how can we kind of incorporate, you've touched upon this a lot, but how can we incorporate some of these race trans studies into inclusive pedagogies for Shakespeare courses? Just looking at that film, as I mentioned, that's one way of doing it, including these clips, having that discussion, I think is just it's such a rich way of discussing theatre of the time, theatre now, different performances and actors' roles, and how actors' roles and their bodies and so on can be used to represent things or draw upon things or emphasize things or and so on. So that's a fantastic start, really, really helpful for teachers. But what are your thoughts on an inclusive curriculum and on our Shakespeare courses?
Yes, I really want to push idea here. Thank you, Wendy, for your very thoughtful reflection. I want to push the idea of using the notion of transness to tackle the systems, CISTM, but also to look at one way to do that, right, is not to insist on only Othello is a race play, as a
Yeah,
lot of Shakespeare studies
exactly.
are,
Yeah.
right? So the so-called non-race films, what happens to them? Or a performance featuring cisgender actors? Well, I say we can excavate implicit or latent transness in all of this. So we need to look at them, look at everything as a race film, look at everything as a film about gender, even if it's an all cisgender cast. So if you look at the screen here, I propose a few solutions. So first is how we use critical race methods, which produces social hierarchies. We use this critical race theory to help trend studies think about the often unacknowledged whiteness. And then we can use trend studies to amplify critical race theory's support of minority life experiences, because trend studies offer us critical tools to understand atypical experiences, and that's really important. So since race and gender are social practices that evolve in each other's presence, we really should think seriously of films that feature actors of the same race, like Stage Beauty. It's an all-white cast, but it is a serious examination of historical blackface and race. And that's one example. And yes, they are cisgender actors, but we can look at Kiniston's role, how he takes on Desdemona as an instance of trans practice. So if we bring it together, we can see transness is really pervasive. In terms of Shakespeare studies, sometimes there's a bit of tendency to privilege the narrative text, the printed text, whatever is kind of solidified in print is seen as more solid, more stable. In fact, if we attend to performance, whether it's film, right, or theater studies, you realize that the printed words alone do not really encompass all the possible meanings. They have to be embodied, right? So we can think of both printed text and ephemeral performance, and we can think about performance theory, for instance, how it can capture transformative cultural practices, transitory spaces like the stage I talked about earlier. So through transness, we can think about processes that produce the category of minorities, rather than just analyzing racial minorities as a predetermined subject. You see, there's a difference here. I'm trying to get students to think about what kind of processes that produce a person like Othello or like Kiniston, rather than saying, let's look at this Othello or Kiniston as a subject already predetermined. I'm less interested in that kind of diagnostic move, but rather we need to look at the processes, the systems that can produce them as such, as this kind of subject. So transness, actually, it is not about co-opting otherness into social norms. To say, for instance, the trans Desdemona should be treated as normal, which of course is important, is part of the goal. But more importantly, transness is really here to estrange the norms themselves. The notion of transness is to make the norms look strange, to make us realize they are not normative after all. When we think about otherness, cultural otherness, we typically think of something that is distant or foreign or different. It is from elsewhere. And so difference becomes an imposition onto normative society, something from outside. But transness would couple this conceptual arrangement of belonging. It actually draws attention to our own society's processes that were other people, stigmatize people, and then how we then label them as others. So that's where I find it useful in pedagogy. We can use translens to look at latent, we can use the translens to look at latent transness in all narratives, in monoracial narratives, in cisgender narratives. And importantly, I tell my students, you don't need to identify as such. We might experience oppressions ourselves, or we are merely witnessing oppression, as in reading literature, or maybe in our real life. Both are valuable because the translens can help us develop trans-adjacent knowledge of race and gender. Judith Butler famously says that no one has to identify with all of the categories in order to care. And I think that's a really important part to convey to students today, because there's often a bit of respectful deferral, which can become a problem in extreme forms. We say, deep down, they would assume it's nothing to do with me. I'm just here to listen. And I often tell them that the people who need race studies or gender studies the most might be the people who don't have to think about them, right? And so we can think about pervasive whiteness or sexism, or even cisgender sexism, to think about all sorts of binary logic. So I have a lot of examples in Shakespeare. Since we're talking about Shakespeare pedagogy, there are a lot of characters who are so-called between and betwixt. Think about Titus Andronicus. You have Aaron and Tamara's baby, right? And what do we do with that? In the Midsummer Night's Dream, you have the changeling, Cleopatra herself, Viola in 12th Night is also a bit betwixt and between, and so forth. So my final point has to do with course content warning or transparency note. A lot of theater companies do that today as well. Now, I've been rethinking this practice. It's supposed to be inclusive, but actually, it's well intended, but sometimes the departure point is a bit of institutionalized notion of purity, which led to monoracial assumptions, cisgender assumptions. So these warnings are based on, first of all, where do they come from? These warnings are based on explicitly what happens in the plot, like what characters say, what characters do explicitly, not what they don't say. Right. So the unspoken motivation, I thought, is as important. And actually, this is very inclusive in terms of urging our students to do a bottom-up reading carefully and finding what potentially could be triggering, rather than just the instructor saying, here's a list. These are potentially triggering issues, and that's it. We can guide students to attend to characters' intentions that may or may not have been stated, develop a more inclusive list of triggering themes. If you think about Titus Andronicus, so a typical list of warnings will include, of course, violence and sexual assault, especially the rape of Lavinia. Now, if we focus on Lavinia's plight, of course, there are good reasons, because it's in a post-Me Too movement era, but it's problematic to leave out anti-Blackness and infanticide in that story, right? If we focus exclusively on Lavinia, we are glossing over the white nurse, the writing comments about the Black baby, who doesn't have a name yet. She's asking Aaron to kill the, quote, joyless, dismal, black, and sorrowful issue. What do we do with that? Granted, in most performances, it's not even a character, it's probably a prop, right? Well, but it's equally important to think about. I would say it's no less triggering. And toward the end, Lucius coerces Aaron the Moor to confess to his crimes. And how does he try to convince him? He says, you hang Aaron and his baby son. So these two people are trying to kill that Black baby. And so Celia Daileader said that if we ignore these incidents, we're actually contributing to the myths about Black male rapacity and the constant need to shield white women from interracial contamination and so forth and so on. So I'm not saying content warning is bad, but we kind of need to rethink how it is done and exactly how we come up with the list. This is actually a pedagogical opportunity. So let's sit down together and think this through. Of course, with an initial list so that some students might excuse themselves, but I think to make it a communal exercise is actually important. So in conclusion, I feel that there are two things. We can do critical race-oriented trans studies and then trans-inclusive race studies. I haven't seen anti-trans behaviors being on the list of kind of triggering issues. For instance, misgendering, dead naming. These are very important.
Yeah.
So that's just an example of how kind of certain things seem more minoritized than others. And the meanings of Shakespeare's plays would change dramatically if we consider a lot of the characters, trans or non-binary, rather than simply cross-dressing that assumes a stable, authentic, true body, anatomy of destiny, and then this clothing, kind of clothes make the man. We perhaps shouldn't divorce these two. Perhaps they are one and the same, right? With Judith Butler's latest gender theory and so on. That is not our focus today, but just some examples where we can really do kind of radical rethinking of all of these plays through the idea of transness in order to explode this system, CISTEM.
Wow, thank you so much. There's so much there to think about that teachers can incorporate in their classrooms and curriculums. That final point about rethinking those content warnings is such an interesting approach, because I really do appreciate and like to deploy where I can student-centered learning and focusing on, that community and including their interests and their engagement. So I think that's really important. I think that's a really interesting way of doing it, having, as you say, perhaps some of examples of showing them some of the examples that have been placed on these plays as content warnings, but then afterwards really dismantling those and adding to it and creating it. I love the possibility that actually with each group that you teach, that list could be different. And then also because the things that I might notice and I might think, oh, that needs to go on the list, somebody else might see something else that I've missed. And so rather than centering myself and my view, I think that's really important. And that's why I've really wanted to have these conversations and create this series, is so that we can include lots of different views and different types of methodologies, which you've really highlighted today. Thank you so much. It's really fascinating. As we draw to a close, I'm asking all of the speakers for the final three questions. So the first one, it's just 3 words you would use to sum up Shakespeare.
The first one that comes to my mind is actually capacious, just because of the possibilities, even if there are accusations of this hyper-canonicity is so canonical, or it is so white. It's a tradition imposed on the canon, largely post-Victorian. It's connected to colonial legacy, but actually it's quite capacious. If for a moment we can rid ourselves of the tradition that's been imposed on us, you actually see all the capacious discussion that is possible.
Yeah.
And the second word that comes to my mind is actually open, both in terms of open pedagogy and the openness, and what some people call dramatic ambiguity. That is the beauty of it, but actually how porous, how open, even at the superficial plot level. Think about 12th Night. How exactly does it end? Double weddings are announced, but refuses to show us. Perhaps it would not happen. And and measure for measure, we don't actually have, at least for me, there's no closure. For some people, it's a problem, but I actually come to appreciate that openness. And perhaps we shouldn't seek false clarity or binary closure. Give me closure, I want poetic justice. That's a feature of it there. And the last word is global.
Yeah.
Global. Because, of course, Shakespeare has gone global during his lifetime, and there are a lot of global imaginations within the canon. But more importantly, there are centuries of global worldwide performances of this canon that's really adding to all the beauty of it. In the US and UK, we may tend to think of, Shakespeare is by default white, therefore diversity work is required. We need to, diversify the cast. But if you look elsewhere, how about Asia, right? The Middle East, it's less of a concern. They do have monoracial kind of cast that consists predominantly of the same race. They are not white. What do we do with that? What lessons do they have for us in doing anti-racist work here, right? So capacious, open, and global, and I have a lot of hope for the future.
Fabulous. Right, two more questions. You've been very generous in sharing other writers and quotes from other writers that I think will be really helpful for teachers to include as well. But are there other writers apart from Shakespeare that you enjoy studying, teaching, or reading?
Virginia Woolf is an amazing writer. Of course, she engages with Shakespeare, but that's not the only reason that I appreciate. For instance, Orlando. I enjoy teaching the novel as well as film adaptations of it. In my trans studies course, Orlando lived through male and female embodiment through several centuries, kind of an immortal being. It's a lot of rich discussion to be had. Beyond Western literature, I teach global cinema, particularly East Asian cinema, and there are a lot of body swapping or cross-gender cinema coming out of Japan and Korea, including anime. A canonical film that has actually made quite a splash in the West is Your Name. And that's just a beautiful kind of imagining the what if a high school girl and high school boy, they wake up in each other's body every morning. So I like the capacity of speculative fiction, how it can open up our imagination. I kind of put it quite simply, that the what if scenario, though in Shakespeare, plenty of that too. So thank you for this question to take us beyond Shakespeare to explore other interests.
Yeah. And then my final question, what do you think is the purpose of education?
The purpose of education is to make thinking possible. It's not to tell you what to think, but rather to equip you with a range of tools so that you can handle complex situations and complex text. Shakespeare, of course, is a perfect example of complex text with layers, but it's not the only sample. There are many others, and I think that's the value of education and the goal to be able to take a deep dive through those and have independent facility with texts and cultural phenomena to think through them.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that's a perfect place to end on that thought. Thank you so much. It's been so fascinating to speak with you today. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much, Wendy, and it's wonderful to be here. Thank you all.